The 1932 film Freaks, directed by Tod Browning, is one of the most controversial films that's ever been released in film history. So today on the channel, I really want to dive into the reasons for this, but also why I also believe it's one of the most compassionate films that's ever been made. So let's get into it. If you're new here, I'm Jordan, and welcome back to my channel. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. So today on the channel, I really want to dissect how Tod Browning employs different techniques and casting choices to really evoke such a strong sense of empathy, and how you can also do this as a director with your own work. So for a little background about the movie Freaks, it was released in February of 1932 by MGM Studios and was directed by Tod Browning. Tod Browning had achieved a lot of fame at this point for his original rendition of Dracula, and this allowed him to have a lot more creative opportunities and choices, especially in the original studio system. The film is loosely based off a short story called Spurs by author Todd Robbins that basically has some of the same elements of a traveling circus in the 30s, but is a lot more grotesque in the original story than you end up actually seeing in the final film. The film follows a traveling circus in the 30s, especially a lot of the circus performers, or freaks as they were called, that have a lot of different physical abnormalities or deformities, and often performed in the sideshow tent or the freak show, which often was to the side of the main big tent, which had some of the other main acts like trapeze artists or people riding horses. And essentially the entirety of the cast in Freaks is made up of actual real circus performers that were scouted out by a location scout and sent to Tod Browning for his request. And essentially all of the actors in the film actually were a part of the circus or performed in sideshows or were on display at freak shows, except for a couple of the actors. The film stars Wallace Ford, Layla Himes, Olga Baklanova, and Roscoe Aites. The story follows a beautiful trapeze artist named Cleopatra, who ends up finding out that one of the little people who's a part of the circus has just inherited a massive family fortune, and so she goes about wooing him, pretending that she loves him, and actually ends up marrying him just in an effort to try to get his fortune. And as we find out, she ends up trying to actually poison and kill him so that she could be the next in line to receive that full inheritance. As the story progresses, more of the performers in the circus start to catch wind of Cleopatra's evil plot and start plotting a more sinister plan for Cleopatra toward the end. Eventually it all comes to a head when at the end they decide to actually initiate Cleopatra and make her one of them, as the famous chant goes, where they say "one of us" in the wedding scene. We accept a one of us. We accept a one of us. And so what they actually end up doing is ensuring physically that she is now one of the performers and deformed circus freaks.
There she is.
So you can use your imagination as to how they go about doing that. That's a large source of the reason why the film was so controversial, especially when it first screened in 1932 and had its premiere in San Diego. The initial screening was so disastrous that people threatened to sue MGM. One woman claimed that she had a miscarriage because of watching the film. In the original cut, which ran roughly an hour and a half, there was an extended sequence where at the end, when they finally trap and catch Cleopatra and the strongman Hercules, who has also been a part of her sinister plot to get the money, they end up mutilating her for a long extended sequence, and they also end up castrating Hercules and converting him into a castrato, which is essentially someone whose testicles have been cut off so that they can sing at a higher pitch. And he ends up having a scene where he actually sings with a very high falsetto. So over half an hour of the film ended up eventually getting cut without Browning's permission at all by the studio. So the final runtime as you see it now is around 60 minutes to about an hour long. And when I first watched it, I wondered what else was supposed to be there. You could tell that so much of the film just totally got butchered and will unfortunately never see the light of day. Well, here's my cat. Hey, Sammy. Sammy, bud, you're gonna have to go, okay? And unfortunately, the original cut will never see the light of day since the footage and the film itself was destroyed, people believe, by the studio so that nobody could ever watch it because of how grotesque it was considered. Because of this initial disastrous reception, so many different countries like the UK and Germany ended up banning the film outright for nearly 30 years. So it ended up taking on this kind of legend and cult status of its own, especially in more recent years, where more and more people started to actually catch wind of it and watch it, and it's now since developed a much wider and greater appreciation, especially in the years that have followed. The unfortunate results of this disastrous reception is that it ultimately had a majorly negative impact on the rest of Tod Browning's film career. The next 4 films that he ended up directing after Freaks ended up being massive box office failures, and he never really was able to reclaim the same critical success or box office success that he was prior to Freaks. In more recent years, critics have really taken to the film much more favorably than when it was initially released in 1932, especially due to Browning's sympathetic portrayal of the circus performers that often were not seen and looked at with the same amount of compassion and humanity and normalcy as we often would see, since they were often put in sideshows for people to gawk at because of how different they were. Critic Andrew Sarris describes the film as one of the most compassionate films ever made, and I would absolutely agree with him. I was shocked at my first viewing of the film how unbelievably compassionate I felt. The first time I watched the film, I was amazed at how much sympathy I felt for every single character. Especially by the end of the film, I felt so much emotion, especially for the circus performers and their plights, and just how much humanity they really did display, even more so than the people who are normal in the film and are supposed to be the people that are caretaking or helpful. One of the most beautiful things about the film is how tight-knit the unit of circus performers is and how much they really have each other's backs, especially when they start realizing this evil plight that Cleopatra is doing for one of their very own members. And Freaks is such a great example of how publicly this film has really evolved in such a positive way over the years. And so sometimes it is one of those things where great art does stand the test of time. I think this is a key example of that, and also just a great illustration of Browning's compassion, also his directing skill, and the fact that he always really kind of was focused on the other. So I'd love to analyze a few scenes from the film that really illustrate Browning's use of cinematic devices to really evoke a strong sense of sympathy, especially from the audience.
You laughed at them, shuddered at them, and yet, but for the accident of birth.
So in this opening scene of the film, which ended up being a reshoot after the disastrous response of the first version of the film,
you might be even as they are.
So this first opening scene that sets up that there's something in an exhibit, we don't know what it is.
You are about to witness the most amazing, the most astounding living monstrosity.
But he mentions that it has something to do with a beautiful woman.
She was once a beautiful woman.
And this is such a great setup that really brings us back into the past so we can start our narrative back before all of these events happen. So essentially we're starting our film in the current day, and everything that they're about to recount has already happened in the past, and we're going to preview what we're eventually going to see in the exhibit. But I love that there's build up to this in the way that they would have done in the freak shows at that time in the 20s and 30s, where there's a lot of a build up. They have a carnival barker who's basically the guy talking, giving the intro.
He was known as the peacock of the air.
Setting it all up before you actually look in to see what is in the exhibit. And so I think the same way that they would have done that in a performance, Tod Browning is doing this with the film. And even though this is technically a reshoot of what was originally not there in the beginning of the film, I think it still ends up setting up the film in such a smart way. Because now we're intrigued and we're so curious of what is in the exhibit, especially when the woman who sees it screams. And we still don't see what she's looking at. So that's one of my favorite devices in all filmmaking, is using an angle to obscure what people on screen are looking at when they look horrified, and us as the audience is just insatiably curious now because we want to know what they're looking at too. They do a great job of this in Hereditary. Ari Aster is a master of this technique. There's a lot of great use of this, especially within the horror genre throughout the years, and I think that's one of the best techniques that came out of horror. One thing I want to note throughout this entire film that Tod Browning does so well is his use of camera movement. There are just some absolutely gorgeous camera dollies where we push in with the camera, especially as we're finishing that opening scene on the carnival barker. It's just such a nice, elegant move, and especially moving the camera at that time in the 30s was so much more cumbersome. The cameras were so much bigger, they were noisy, there was film, the rigs had to be so much bigger, they were heavier. So it really is a testament to just the skill set and the technology heat of the day that they were able to still move the camera so seamlessly without a lot of bumps that sometimes you would still see in older films. So I really want to shout out the beautifully elegant camera work throughout this whole film. There's also something about just seeing the time capsule of the 30s cinematography, and I'm sure this has probably been restored in some way, but either way, it just looks gorgeous. I mean, the black and white, the 4:3 aspect ratio, the old Academy aspect ratio with pillar box with the black bars on either side. It just looks amazing, and there's something about the old black and white cinematography with the hard lighting coming from up above, very harsh shadows, very bright lighting on the face, very heavily filtered, especially around the close-ups of the actresses to make them look more beautiful and pleasing on screen. All of these things just immediately transport me to that moment in time in the 30s, and I would argue that the cinematography in this film and a lot of films that era were much more gorgeous than a lot of the films that I see today, especially shot digitally. That's just my opinion, but I think there's something beautiful that takes you right back into that era, or as close as you can to feeling that era, especially when you see these opening images. There's also something that's beautiful about the quality of the way the actors talked. They talked in a little closer to that transatlantic accent, which is sort of the old movie accent that actors would talk in. That's not really a real accent of any place on the planet.
She's the most beautiful big woman I have ever seen. Why, hon?
But it's so specific to those older movies. Immediately when you hear it, you just think this is an older film. There's something special and novel about it. Immediately we meet probably our two most important characters in the film, Hans and his fiancée, Frida.
I should be jealous pretty soon. Don't be silly.
What's very funny is in real life, they actually were siblings. They were both little people that were part of a full family of little people that performed in the circus. It was Daisy Earls and Harry Earls are the two siblings that play Hans and Frida in the film. And there's something so special about their performances in this movie. And perhaps my favorite character is Frida in this film. The amount of sympathy and how much I feel for her throughout the entire film is incredibly palpable and makes me emotional even just thinking about it because of how much she has love for Hans, and she is seeing Hans getting taken advantage of by this horrible person, Cleopatra, who we end up absolutely despising throughout the film. And ironically, the thing that's so interesting to me is at the end when she gets her extremely grotesque comeuppance, as an audience, we feel like it's deserved. There's almost this interesting Schadenfreude that's created. One of the most interesting things is in the same breath where you can feel so much compassion for the people in the film and emotional, you also feel this intense Schadenfreude at the end, especially when Hercules and Cleopatra get their brutal comeuppance. We almost feel that it's justified. We almost don't feel bad. We almost feel excited that they're gonna get what they deserve, which is kind of a scary feeling. One of the things that's so compelling to me about Freaks is that throughout the film, Browning does such a great job of constantly evoking sympathy and really making us identify more with the circus performers, especially Frida. And as we see Hans continuing to get taken advantage of and him further and further getting humiliated by Hercules and Cleopatra in such despicable ways, we get angrier and angrier. We start to really identify with the plight of all of the other performers in the circus, especially the ones who really have love for Hans and they appreciate him and they want to do something about it. And one of the big central themes that hammers this home is in the wedding scene. Where Hans finally agrees to marry Cleopatra, still believing that she actually has love for him. He's still blissfully ignorant of what her real intentions are, even though he knows that she might not potentially actually want him for him. He's still just believing the best in her naively, even though she really doesn't deserve it. And so when they're in the wedding scene and they start to chant,
"We accept her, one of us. We accept her, one of us.
Gooba gobble, gooba gobble.
one of us, we accept her, one of us.
We accept her, we accept her. Google gobble, Google gobble. One of us, one of us."
That really is the central theme, that they are actually trying to accept her, bring her into the fold because she's going to be with Hans and Hans is one of them.
They're going to make you one of them. My peacock.
Now we accept her, bring her in. And she's so disgusted by this that she throws a drink on one of the other performers' faces. And she has a meltdown because
Get out of here! You! Come!
she is so disgusted by the freaks that she could never be one of them. She could never be anything less than normal or beautiful or a trapeze performer. So even Hercules points out drunkenly that they're going to make you one of them. This ends up becoming the full-scale payoff that we really reference to here in this scene. And so eventually when they do end up actually taking the mob justice and deforming her and mutilating her, making her a literal freak now to be displayed, when she gets that comeuppance, as an audience, you feel that it's so justified. You actually get excited when you see them starting to go and attack her in the rain. And the original sequence apparently was much more grotesque and explicit. That ended up mostly getting cut out of the final cut. In many ways, the curious part of my brain really actually does wish we could see that, just to see how far they actually go. I don't know if that ends up changing the way that you feel about how they're justified in doing what they do. One of the eerie parts about watching this film is that even though you feel so much sympathy, you also feel excited when they end up mutilating these people because of how horrible they've been. And I do think in a lot of ways you still end up leaving the film feeling like it was justified. So interesting way that this film creates this dichotomy, and it also presents the argument that they're not totally wrong in doing that to Cleopatra and Hercules for how horrible they've been to them this entire movie. So I always think good drama presents different arguments and makes really good cases for either side of looking at an issue, especially if one of them does end up justifying the use of violence because violence has been used against them this entire time. So much in the way that we talked about this with Psycho and how Norman Bates's worldview is that
we scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other.
We're all in our own traps. We're all clawing at each other. So me doing it isn't really an issue because everybody else has been doing it to me and each other the whole time. It's sort of the same type of philosophy where you do kind of wonder, should they have done that? Maybe they shouldn't. Using violence maybe is never the answer. But at the same time, this film makes the point that sometimes it is. I think that's very interesting. But I think this film presents the viewpoint that if you're pushed to the extremes and it's resorted to, sometimes that is just the result of being ostracized for so long and villainized by mainstream culture. This is sometimes what happens when anyone's pushed to their breaking point. Upon rewatching the clip right now, I think one of the reasons we feel so much sympathy, especially for both Hans and Frida, is partly that obviously their stature is lower. So I think there is, without infantilizing, there's this effect that we immediately feel just more sympathy because of the quality of their voice is much higher pitched because they're smaller sized people. So I think that's one of the things that causes us to feel that sympathy for them right away, is just seeing how good natured they are, how they interact with each other, how much love Frida has for Hans.
But ich kann es nicht helfen. If you could be happy, Hans, I would not care.
But the fact that in some ways, I think we almost can't help but see them almost closer to children. And obviously they're not children, and I don't mean to propose that they are like children, but I think psychologically in our brains, there's something that evokes this sympathy much quicker than if we see a normal actor on screen right away. I think one of the most important parts about the film too is the way that Browning's use of the camera shooting these different people is shot with so much compassion and humanity. We get to see them really lit well. We get to see their expressions. We get to see the way that they are just people and they're doing normal things. And some of the blocking he uses is having them just be normal people, singing, hanging out in a park, experiencing joy. And I think that's one of the things that further allows us to see that these are people too, just like us. They just look a little different. That's the only thing that's different between them and us, but they're still doing normal activities. They still can live normally or closer to, and they can still actively engage in all the things that we could do too. I think that's the thing that makes us feel really invested and more closely aligned with the performers in the film. There's this beautiful line where one of the women who works in the circus, these two men encounter her with a lot of the circus performers out in the field, and one of the guys has this violent reaction like, what are they doing? Get them out of here.
Go away, all of you! Don't you know trespassing the same as stealing?
he's almost repulsed. And I think that's the way that a lot of people looked at people who were different, especially circus freaks or performers, people with deformities.
These children are in my circus.
Children? They're monsters.
And I love that the woman who's with them, their caretaker, she basically says,
I like to take them into the sunshine and let them play like children.
I do think that idea is further reinforced of sometimes we look at these circus performers, even though they're grown adults, like children. And that naturally evokes a sense of sympathy for us. I think the way we look at children is always with a little more sympathy than adults, because we know that children don't necessarily know better. They don't have the life experience. Their brain isn't developed enough to know necessarily between right and wrong. So that in and of itself grants us a sense of this innocence and naivety that in some ways is pure and makes us look at people differently. And I really think the performances of all of the actors in the film are just amazing, because the way that they look at the other characters, a lot of the circus performers in the film really don't have any lines, but it's just the way they look at the camera, the way they're shot. They each get their own closer angles and inserts. And I think this further humanizes them in the way that the camera angles are structured. And I think what is important is we also see interactions where some of the other circus performers who are quote unquote normal, they have some negative interactions with the performers and are actively mean and treat them like freaks and others or beasts.
There she goes, taking them out to exercise. Nice to a lot of mangy freaks.
And then we also do have certain performers with the circus who are normal, who treat them with compassion and humanity.
Oh, let's see, what a pretty dress. Oh, how beautiful you look tonight.
And again, I think this further just serves to isolate the people who are the villains and the people who actually are the heroes, but it makes us identify and realize, again, they're just normal people, because we're seeing and we're normalizing normal people can totally treat and coexist in the circus the exact same way that they would with other normal people.
Hasn't Slitsy got a beautiful dress? Isn't that pretty? When I get to Paris, I'm going to buy her a big hat with a long feather on it.
And I think this choice also just serves to further humanize them whenever we see those interactions on screen. There's this amazing scene, and it's one of my favorite shots in the whole film, where one of the gentlemen in the film who has no limbs, he has no arms and no legs, and there's a scene where he literally lights a cigarette completely with his mouth. I mean, he moves the matchbox, he opens it, flips it up, strikes the match, blows it out, lights it. It's just an amazing, and it just shows you that some of these people, even if they have certain abnormalities physically, again, can still do normal tasks. And I think this, again, further empowers the people in the film, and it further empowers us as viewers watching the film and watching them to also see them doing these things capably, and makes us feel like they're just as capable as any person doing any normal task, which I love. I also love the character of Froso the clown, played by Wallace Ford.
I had a swell dream about you last night.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
And then Venus, who is played by Layla Hyams, absolutely gorgeous.
And the wind was blowing through your hair and the waves were washing around you.
I love how they're getting together romantically throughout the film.
Oh. Yeah, it's the first time you've ever done that.
But they are also treating everyone else, all the other performers, with so much compassion.
Oh, don't you worry, Frida. He doesn't love her. Oh, that big horse.
There's a scene where Frozo's talking to one of the women who has microcephalia, which is where typically you have shorter stature, and it's what people often would call pinheads, which is probably not the right term, but he treats her with so much compassion and respect, and the way she smiles and laughs and gets giddy with joy is just, it makes me feel so much joy to see that, and just further endears us to the fact that they deserve to be treated with compassion, perhaps even more so than just your average person.
And if you're a good girl, when I get to Paris, I'm going to buy you a hat with a bigger feather on it.
So I think that's such a beautiful illustration of that too. It's absolutely a beautiful scene of him talking with Schlitzie, which that actually was her name in real life too. She was a real circus performer with microcephalia, and she's having this full dialogue talking back to him, and it's amazing the way that he's responding and treating her with just so much compassion. It's amazing.
Oh, let's see, what a pretty dress. Oh, how beautiful you look tonight.
And then this next scene too, we see again one of the women who has no arms. She's using her feet, she's eating, she's using her feet to hold the fork and eating just as normally as anybody else without any difficulty.
Well, it wasn't.
Just the Rollo brothers, panicking them again. But then we do it in every town.
Quite amazing. So I think that's one of the strengths of the film, is showing the circus performers in different environments doing and living like normal people. One of my favorite scenes in the whole film is when Frida goes to visit Hans and basically make her case. She's basically trying to plead with him to say, don't go through with getting together with Cleopatra. Don't marry her. She doesn't love you. She is only going to laugh at you. And there's this incredible line that she uses that I'll play after this, but she basically says to him, oh, I love this line. It's incredible. So she says to him, ooh, I'm gonna get emotional thinking about it. Admittedly, trying to say this line and get it out is actually making me emotional. I'm struggling to get it out without being brought to tears. But she says to him,
To me, you're a man. But to her, you're only something to laugh at.
She sees him as an equal. She'll always look at him as he already was normal. There's nothing different about him. But Cleopatra is only ever going to see him as a joke. She's only going to laugh at him. She doesn't take him seriously. His size and difference in stature, she will always hold against him, even though there's nothing he could have done about that. So I love that she's saying, I'm right here. I see you for all that you are. I'm going to appreciate you. And yet Han still isn't quite ready to hear this. And so he says,
Let them laugh. They're swine. I love her. They can't hurt me.
he's saying, well, I've been laughed at my whole life, so this isn't any different. I can handle this. I can take this. I've already handled this my whole life. I also just love Daisy Earle's performance as Frida in this film. I think perhaps one of the other sources of evoking so much empathy and sympathy for her plight is her performance, the quality of her voice. Every time she's talking with Hans, she's almost on the verge of tears, and she's basically pleading with him to just say, please, see reason. I'm right here. I've always been here. I would never make you change anything about yourself because what you already have is beautiful to me.
But they hurt me.
So I think that in and of itself, the way they shoot her, her hair, her performance is just absolutely beautiful here. The way she says, hun.
If you could be a happy Hans, I would not care.
Throughout, it's just incredible. And I think she also has this German accent, and the way that they have a slight diffusion over the close-ups when they shoot her.
It is only that you should be happy, I want.
It again further seeks to humanize her, put her in almost a leading lady role, and her performance is my favorite. She's my favorite character in this whole movie. So I definitely want to shout out her beautiful work here. The wedding feast scene is also an incredible scene where it's the marriage of Hans and Cleopatra.
Wedding night.
And of course, we know she's doing this just to get his money. Even at the wedding scene, though, what's incredible to me is how disrespectful she is. She's not even trying to pretend like she actually loves him or is going to be nice to him.
What are you going to do? What are you, a man or a baby?
She's just blatantly rude the entire time, disrespects him, actively, puts him on her shoulders, moves around, and just totally humiliates him in front of his whole crew. And I think that's their last straw, where they're all done with her antics, and now they start the actual plotting of what will eventually become the most brutal comeuppance probably in any film I've seen. But I love that this all starts here, where they actually give her a chance. They start the chant, the famous chant. And that's, I think, them trying to say, hey, we are definitely accepting you. We're going to try to bring you into our fold. That's the circus way, as we're in this together. And just her reaction, how violent it is, and how unbelievably disrespectful she is this whole time, along with Hercules, just further serves to make us as the audience feel even more and more hatred for her. And that she does deserve every single thing that's coming to her. So I think this is also an interesting thing that I caught on this viewing, where they're saying gooble gobble, gooble gobble. Eventually what they end up turning her into, which is a chicken with no limbs, and she's literally quacking. I wonder if that Google Gobble is a reference to what they're already planning to do, if they already knew they were going to do that. So another way you could read the scene is they're already planning to induct her. They're just having fun chanting because they know what they're about to do, which is a more sinister and insidious take on it. But again, up until this point, we also established she's been poisoning Hans, putting that in his wine to try to kill him so she can actually take the money. So I think when they really get wise to this, that's when they said, okay, we're gonna physically make you one of us. So I think that's also the part that's so sinister behind the undertones of the scene, is they're chanting, and it's a fun scene the way it's blocked, but beneath that is all of this carnage that's to come. The amazing finale scene where it all comes to a head. This is probably one of, if not the most famous scene in the film, and again was a longer version that was much more grotesque, showed a lot more in the original cut that we'll never see, and a lot of it totally got cut out when they did the re-edit without Tod Browning's consent or his involvement. But this scene itself still is so amazing the way it's still intact. And so finally Hans gets wise to the fact that she's been putting poison in the wine. He finally starts to believe everybody else who's been telling him she's bad news, this is what she's doing, and then he finally is on board.
Tonight, they will be ready. All right, you come to my wagon.
He's almost sort of the ringleader of the whole bunch, and so once he finally gives the sort of seal of approval, they really do start to plot and go ahead with their ultimate plan. This is a great scene out of the horror textbooks where it's raining, it's nighttime, the carriages are starting to pull through a muddy field that's only getting wetter and more muddy. It's the perfect backdrop for something bad to happen, as we'll come to see. And the thing that I love so much about the way this scene is shot is once the carriages start tipping and eventually Hercules and Froso get into a fight, where they finally fall out of the carriage into the mud and it's raining and they're having this brawl basically. One thing I love about that is Froso is literally going to fight for the other performers. He's there for them and he's willing to literally go toe to toe with this guy just to prove that. And he also has probably more ability just to take him on just in a fist fight just because he's closer to his size. So that's something I find awesome. Makes me love Froso even more. But the thing I love so much about this scene is you can tell all the circus freaks start getting their plan in action. They're so deliberate, they're calm, they've been ready for this for a while, and so they all are just ready, and it's raining and they're just very stoic the way they approach, and they approach their target so slowly. And their targets are so helpless. It just ends up becoming such a terrifying scene the way it's shot. And I wish we could have seen the full version of the film and what was included. But to me, this again further serves this interesting Schadenfreude it produces in us, where when Cleopatra and Hercules get their comeuppance, we are not only ready for it, we're excited when it happens. It's amazing. You see some of the women, the pinheads that are crawling under the carriage with the rain and the shadow, and they all have weapons, they have knives. It's just incredible to see. And again, this speaks to the strength of the shooting, the cinematography, the blocking here, where the camera is just moving ever so slowly as if it's the POV of the people, of the circus performers that are pursuing Hercules especially. And again, I think Browning does a great job of using those camera angles to put us in the headspace of it's as if we're pursuing Hercules, because in a way we almost feel like we would want to also, because of how much we're identifying with their plight. Even the guy with no limbs, he has a knife in his mouth and he's sort of just wobbling over. I mean, just amazing. And then unfortunately, we just see Cleopatra run into the woods against a tree with a lot of the other members of the circus in full pursuit, and she screams, we cut away. There absolutely was a lot more to that scene that apparently was much more violent and grotesque, the way that they end up mutilating her. And now finally we come back to the bookend of the very opening scene. We're back in the present day.
How she got that way will never be known. Some say a jealous lover.
With the carnival barker, and we're outside the exhibit where we're finally about to reveal what did they actually do to her. One of the things that I love that really encapsulates the philosophy of the performers, he says, is how she got that way will never be known. It could have been a jealous lover. It could have been the code of the freaks.
That it was the code of the freaks. Others the storm.
Or it could have been the storm. And I think it really does emphasize the fact that the circus freaks do have their own code that they follow. And that really is to take care of their own. And they really do prove that throughout this. And so I think that very much encapsulates their whole philosophy when they eventually end up making her one of their own as well. That's also probably one of the most famous images in the whole film too, where now she's literally made into a chicken. She has...
There she is.
Basically no legs. She has like a tuft. She just has arms. They probably ripped out. She's quacking like a chicken. It's just a pretty disturbing image in some ways, but again, you can't almost help but feel like it was justified and shocking in the same breath. Apparently there was also more of Hercules we were supposed to see, where he's now singing with a falsetto because he's been castrated. So that also got cut out. One other thing they added in this very last scene of the film that also was a reshoot is we get to finally see the reunion of Hans and Frida.
Oh, yes, you can, Hansi, old boy. There's someone you just gotta see.
And it's amazing because Frida's brought there by Froso and Venus, who are also together.
Why did you come here? Please, Hans, don't be angry.
And when they eventually make their exit to give them their privacy.
Don't cry, Hans. Come to me, my Liebchen. Don't cry.
That really does kind of hammer home the whole idea that he finally did come back to Frida, gave her a chance. And they ended in this beautifully, emotionally poignant scene when literally the scene before was so disturbing and horrific. And then we go back to this emotional place of it really is still about their love story in a lot of ways.
Don't cry. I love you. I love you.
So I think Freaks really is such a great combination of a love story, a character drama, and also a horror film, all wrapped up into one in a circus film. So I think Browning does such a great job of bringing in all of these genres so fluidly and making us feel such a range of emotions in ways that may make us feel uncomfortable but are true. It's interesting to note here, if you look at the cinematography, especially of this last scene, that because it was a reshoot and something might have happened differently with the cameras on the day or the lighting or the development of the film, you can definitely see that the film is a little bit overexposed and it's a little blown out on the faces and the highlights in a way that we haven't seen throughout any other shots in the film. So I think that's also a key indicator that this was a reshoot that happened after the main principal photography finished. What's also so beautiful is the ending images of them hugging Hans and Frida, and Hans still feels bad about what happened. Even though it was justified, he still feels bad about what happened to Cleopatra, and he has so much integrity. He even questions if that should have happened, and it was his idea, and he's taking ownership for them deciding to eventually do it. And she's basically saying, no, it's not your fault. This is something that she basically brought upon herself, which I'd agree with. And she says, I love you, and we end the film. So
I love you. I love you.
what an amazing film. I am so glad that I found out about this film only a month or so ago, and now it's literally become one of my favorite films of all time, just because of the range of horror they show, but also the range of empathy they develop and the amount of compassion they're able to evoke within you as a viewer for people that are different and look different, but really aren't different at all if you really think about it. So that's what I love so much, is this story really is about humanity at its core and is absolutely highly recommended film, definitely worth checking out. It's actually streaming for free on Tubi right now, so definitely check it out. I'll put a link below where you can check out the film. If you've seen it, I'd love to hear your favorite memories of the first time that you watched it, or your favorite scene in the film, or what the film means to you. Or if you get a chance to watch it after this video, please drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if you have any other interpretations of the film, drop them below because I'd love to hear it. That concludes why Freaks is one of the most controversial films of all time, but also one of the most compassionate. Let me know if there's any other films that you want me to cover in a future video, and I will definitely make sure we get them covered. And for more movie breakdowns, you can check out more of my videos like this breakdown I did on Psycho, which you can find here, so definitely give it a watch. And stay tuned for next week, where we'll continue to break down different classic horror films from a writing and directing standpoint, so I will definitely see you then.